Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to the afternoon testimony. We're very much looking forward to hearing from the representatives of the tenants. And I believe Patrick will be starting, and then we'll hear from Tim when he arrives. Thank you so much.
Folks hear me? Yes. Thank you. My name is Patrick Markee. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst at Coalition for the Homeless, and I appreciate this opportunity to testify before the board about the record homelessness crisis in New York City and its link to the housing affordability crisis. Just to give some of you some information about Coalition for the Homeless, those of you who don't know, we're the oldest advocacy and direct services organization assisting homeless New Yorkers in the United States and in New York City. Our founders were working together in the late 70s when modern homelessness, there we go, that's probably better. Our founders were working together in the late 70s when modern homelessness first emerged in New York City and in the country, and we were incorporated in 1981. Although we're best known for our advocacy and public policy work, which is the work that I supervise at the Coalition, we also operate 12 direct services programs that help more than 3,000 homeless and low-income New Yorkers every day of the year. Those programs include feeding vans that feed around 1,000 people on the streets every night of the year, a job training program for homeless and low-income women, a summer camp for homeless children, and 4 permanent housing programs. So we are also landlords as well as advocates for tenants. And we also operate an eviction prevention program that assists families and individuals who are at risk of homelessness. So my testimony today is going to draw largely on city data about the historic and unprecedented scale of the homelessness crisis in New York City. Simply put, as many of you may have seen from a report that we issued back in March, our annual State of the Homeless report from which much of this data is drawn, we are now experiencing the worst homelessness crisis in New York City since the Great Depression of the 1930s, with more homeless men, women, and children sleeping in our city shelter system than at any time since the city's been keeping records and since modern homelessness emerged in the late 70s and early 80s. Last year was the worst year for homelessness in New York since the Great Depression. In January, there were more than 53,000 homeless men, women, and children sleeping in the shelter system each year, a 7% increase from the previous year. That total includes more than 22,000, now approaching 23,000 children, an 8% increase from the previous year. And in a very troubling metric, the average shelter stay for families is now 14 and a half months. That's up 60 days from the previous year. So families are staying in shelter longer than ever. Homeless families and children make up 4/5 of the shelter population. So contrary to the stereotype that probably the general public has about who's homeless and who experiences homeless, the typical homeless person in New York City is in a family. The number of families entering the city shelter system in the past year also was up from the previous year by 12%. And since 2002, the homeless shelter population in New York has increased by 71%, and the number of homeless families is up by a remarkable 83%. So these charts illustrate the stats we just talked about. This shows the city's homeless shelter population since the early 80s when modern homelessness began. And as you can see in the past decade, just a dramatic increase in the homeless population. This shows those numbers over the past year, from January 2013 to January of this year, a 7% increase. Here you see the sort of cross-section of the shelter population, the 22,700 children in shelters each night, more than 19,000 adults and families, mostly the parents of those children, and 11,000 homeless single adults, single men and women. Here you see the increase in the number of homeless children. As I said, nearly 22,000 children in shelter each night, the highest levels ever recorded, and an 8% increase in the number of homeless children over the past year. And then the numbers of homeless families, we now have nearly 13,000 homeless families in shelters each night. That's more than twice what it was when, or around twice what it was when I started working at the Coalition for the Homeless back in the 90s. So just a really remarkable increase in family homelessness. And those numbers increased 6% over the past year. And then finally, numbers of homeless single adults. One of the most troubling findings from last year's data was that the numbers of homeless single adults in shelters, which had actually peaked in the late 1980s and then had declined when the city and state invested in supportive housing for people living with mental illness and other disabilities, those numbers are now back on the rise and are actually higher than they were at any point in the 80s. Those numbers increased by 5% over the past year. As I mentioned earlier, families are staying in the shelter system longer and longer. This shows you that trend over the past year. Now, families staying in shelter an average of 435 days or 14 and a half months. Again, back in the 1990s when I started at the Coalition, the average shelter stay for families was around 9 months. And in some points in the early 90s, it was actually much less than that. It was around 6 months. Families without children actually stay in shelter even longer, an average of 17 months. And those numbers have grown significantly over the last year. The large majority of homeless families in the city are families with children, but there's a subpopulation of that group that's families without children. And then, as I said, the numbers of families entering the shelter system increased last year from 12,000 to more than 13,000 families. These are families coming into the shelter system. So there's obviously remarkable turnover in that population. I'll talk about that in a minute. Last year was, as you'll see in this chart, the fourth worst year since the city's been keeping records in terms of the numbers of families coming into our shelter system. The worst years being just in the wake of the economic crisis in 2008, 2009. And another very troubling trend is the fact that more and more families coming into our shelter system are families who were formerly homeless, many of them very recently formerly homeless. This reflects in large part the fact that the majority of families leaving shelter now are not leaving to subsidized housing because of the failure of policies under the previous mayoral administration, but are families that are leaving shelter on their own, primarily into unsubsidized, mostly rent-stabilized housing, and then are unable to afford those rents, and many of them end up becoming homeless once again and coming back into the shelter system. So we're seeing lots and lots of families who are making 2-3 trips through the shelter system over various years. I mentioned earlier the fact that there's turnover in the system. So there's one way of counting homelessness in New York is to talk about the number of people who are homeless on a given night. As I said, now we have more than 53,000 homeless people in our shelter system each night. But over the course of a year, far more people actually utilize that shelter system. More than 110,000 different men, women, and children actually utilized the city shelter system in the last city fiscal year, and that was a 5% increase from the previous year. So just a remarkable number of people who were forced to turn to the city shelter system. And of that 111,000 people who used the shelter system, more than 40,000 of them were children. A 7% increase from the previous year. I'm sure many of you saw the remarkable New York Times investigative series about Dasani Coates, homeless, I think now she's 12 years old, girl and her family who resided for so long in city shelters. They're one of these families that was forced to make multiple trips through the shelter system, largely because of affordability problems, their inability to afford the rents on apartments, particularly when short-term housing subsidies that the city had provided them under the last administration expired. I think Dasani is just one of 40,000 kids who utilized the city shelter system over the course of a year. A major cause, in our view, of record homelessness in New York City, in addition to the flawed policies of the previous administration, has been the worsening affordability crisis. Simply put, and I think my colleagues from the Community Service Society will testify in even more detail about this afterwards, the fact that there's just a widening gap between the incomes of New Yorkers, particularly low-income New Yorkers, and housing costs and apartment rents. We now have a situation where nearly 1 in 3 children and more than 1 out of 5 households in the city are living in poverty. I'm sure some of you saw the study that the city just released that talked about Nearly half of New Yorkers living just above at 150% of the poverty line, and so struggling, and an increase also in families living sort of below the federal poverty line. So that's the reality that we're seeing, certainly in our front office. Since 2002, a 39% loss in apartments affordable to low-income New Yorkers. And that trend that I was talking about, where rents are going up and incomes are going down or stagnating at best, certainly has been a major factor since the Great Recession, since just before the Great Recession. What we see is more and more families who are working, who are homeless, and simply can't afford market rents. One measure of that, the fact that a minimum wage worker actually earns less than the monthly rent that's set by the federal government as a fair market rent for the federal housing voucher program. What we also saw, and city officials testified to this several years ago, is that working families were families, the typical working family who's homeless was earning about $9 to $9.50 an hour, working about 32 hours a week, and so their monthly income was in the range of $1,100 a month, and the apartment rents, the asking rents that they were finding when they were going out, even into some of the poorest neighborhoods in the city, were $1,100 a month for a two-bedroom apartment. So for the families that we work with, this is simply a math problem. You know, if literally your income isn't enough for you to afford rent, how are you supposed to find housing when you're homeless? Again, another reflection of that, the fact that nearly a third of homeless families, I think it's about 30% of homeless families, are working, have employment income. Again, this is very much in contrast to the stereotype. And as the New York Times reported last September, the number of working homeless people in New York, and particularly in our shelter system, has increased significantly in recent years. Since 2010, the number of working homeless people has increased by 57%. So we're seeing more and more working folks in our shelter system. And these are folks working one, sometimes two or more jobs. So again, here the poverty rate for households, 21%, for children, 31% in New York City. Again, as my colleagues from CSS, from the Community Service Society, will testify, just a significant loss in in apartments affordable to low-income households over the last decade. A gap between incomes and rents, where the trends are that rents are on the rise and incomes for renters since just before the Great Recession have actually been falling. And here you see that comparison I was mentioning between what a minimum wage worker's income would be and what federal fair market rents are for a two-bedroom apartment. And the increase in the number of working homeless shelter residents. So we've got, as I said, about 30% of homeless families in our shelter system have employment income. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's about somewhere between 15 and 20% of homeless single adults have employment income. So we're just seeing more and more working folks trapped in our shelter system. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. I guess I would just close by saying, we strongly support the call for no increase in rents this year. We think that one of the major things that has contributed to the affordability problems that I discussed here and has contributed significantly to record homelessness in the city over the past years has been high increases on rents for rent-stabilized housing that the board under the previous administration authorized. I think an analysis of those increases would show that they were I think the highest increases since maybe the Koch administration, certainly for two-year leases. So significantly high increases at a time, I think it's important to recognize, when the city was undergoing one of the worst economic crises since the Great Depression of the 30s. And so that's, again, one of the major reasons that we've seen homelessness increase so much, and that's the reality that the families and individuals that we serve are encountering every day. With that, I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you. This measures the people staying in shelters. Is there any measurement of people who actually sleep on the streets and how that's changed over time?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I'm sorry for not addressing that. There is not, and never has been, an accurate measurement of the unsheltered homeless population in New York. The city is required by the federal government, in order to receive certain federal homeless services funding, to do an estimate every year, which they do. And some folks may have seen, news reports about the city sent volunteers out on a single night, winter night, to count the homeless, and they sort of call this the homeless count. It's not a count. It's actually a survey where folks go out and cover maybe about a fifth of the territory of the city, and then produce a statistical estimate. We and others feel that it's a very flawed estimate, that it misses lots of folks, and academic researchers who've kind of looked at this issue have found that the large numbers of homeless people don't sleep in the places that would be likely to be found by the surveyors. They sleep in sort of non-visible locations. I think it's all sort of common sense. Anybody who's sort of worked with or talked to folks who are homeless on the streets know you're not going to be sleeping in the most visible place where you'll be found by an enumerator. Having said that, the city estimates around 3,000 people on the streets and in the subway system on the sort of coldest nights of the year. Again, we think that that's an underestimation, but it's still a significant number. And the numbers that I should also say that the numbers that I reported here capture the very largest part of the homeless population in the city, which is homeless people in the shelter system administered by the city's Department of Homeless Services. Other city agencies operate smaller shelter systems, for instance, for homeless and runaway youth, for survivors of domestic violence, for homeless people living with HIV and AIDS. Altogether, that population of folks in shelter is about 5,000 people, including also some folks in faith-based shelters operated by churches and synagogues. So it's this number is the largest part of it, but there's another 3,000 plus folks on the streets and 5,000 folks in other shelters.
But I'm also wondering whether that 3,000, 5,000 figure, how that relates to what it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago.
One of the real problems, one of the real problems is there just isn't good data on that. I mean, I think there's a sense that there were more folks on the streets in the late 80s and early 90s than there are now, but that the numbers that are on the streets now have increased in recent years, if that answers your question. But again, it's one of the, this is a problem researchers have struggled with for years. There just isn't really good data on the unsheltered homeless population. They don't check in. They don't check in, yes.
Actually, can you, one thing I wasn't sure about was the shelter capacity itself, actual shelter capacity. I mean, you've had to absorb, massive increases. Has the shelter capacity changed? And also, you'd mentioned supportive housing, and I wasn't really sure what that was.
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
That's good.
It's a very good question. So the city of New York, since 1981, has entered into consent decrees and court orders in which it's required to provide shelter to every homeless single adult and every homeless family that's in need of shelter. There have been problems over the last 3 decades in sort of how the city does that, but in general, the city is required to provide shelter to kind of meet the need, to meet the when folks are coming into shelter. As a result, the city absolutely has had to increase its shelter capacity in recent years. As I said, in 2002, there were about 31,000 people in shelter each night. It's now more than 53,000 people, so that's that 71% total increase in the shelter population. So the city has had to expand shelter capacity quite dramatically, and at significant cost. I mean, the city this year will spend more on shelter than at any time in the past, and obviously we and others would feel that money could be better spent on permanent housing assistance. And then to answer your second question, supportive housing is a term, sorry, it's a little bit of a jargony term, I apologize. It's permanent supportive housing is a model of housing that combines subsidized housing for individuals and families, obviously who are low income, mostly formerly homeless, but who are living with mental illness or with other serious disabilities, with special needs. It's a model of housing that's been proven to be very successful and to work quite well. It's permanent housing, so it's kind of one of those models that, as I said, would be better than having the shelter system grow and grow, but has been proven to be very successful.
All right then. You mentioned on page 1 that the average stays for family is about 14 and a half months 14 and a half months and up to 60 days and almost for the last year. My question is, what happens after that? Is there a follow-up to know, do you call them up? Is there a survey that says, are you back to work? Did you find permanent apartment? Or are you living with family members? Is there such a thing as a follow-up with homeless?
You mean like when families have left the shelter system,
Yeah,
what
yeah.
happens? Well, there again, I think the very troubling trend, and I think I referred to this, is that what we're seeing now is that in the absence of permanent housing resources and housing subsidies to help families leave shelter into this very expensive housing market, many families are sort of leaving on their own, but into arrangements that they can't really afford, that become very kind of precarious and temporary. So we've seen families that will save up some money, some working families will save up some money, enough money to put down a security deposit and a first month's rent on an apartment, hoping against hope that they'll be able to keep that apartment over time. But in many, many instances, what happens is those families simply can't afford those rents going forward. It's just not affordable to them. I mean, just to give an example, I think you can think of the problem in sort of three ways. As I mentioned, we operate an eviction prevention program. So we see lots of families who are at risk of homelessness who are coming to us. These are families who've lost jobs in this economy or had a sort of a family emergency, maybe a medical emergency in the family. For some reason, they've fallen behind on their rent. They need some help, and we provide sort of emergency financial grants to help them sort of afford their homes and stay in. Far more people come to us for help than we have the resources to help them, which I think is reflected in the numbers that you've probably all seen about just the increasing numbers of evictions in the city and all of that. But for those families, they're coming in, many of them in apartments, rent-stabilized apartments, by and large, that are, at relatively modest rents, $800-900 a month, but they're having trouble affording that. Now picture a family that's in the shelter system. Asking rents on apartments when they need to leave the shelter system are much higher, $1,100-1,200 a month. So they're having a much harder time finding apartments that they can afford. When their incomes are $1,100 or $1,200 a month and the asking rent is that same number, these families are going to have a very hard time making it. And that's the reality that we're seeing, is that these families are just confronting a much more expensive and costly housing market than they have before. We see that play out in our housing programs as well. So we operate a temporary rental assistance program, and it's a program that provides a fairly modest amount of rental assistance to working families and individuals. We've had a much harder time finding apartments that our clients can afford, and we've had to, as a result, work with families and individuals who have much higher incomes than we used to in the past, because it's just much harder to bridge that gap between the incomes and rents.
I'm curious if you can comment on the homeless crisis nationwide, in particular high-cost cities, perhaps, and as well as any other cities that have rent stabilization, perhaps? If you any correlation there.
I can't really comment on other cities with rent stabilization, and I don't think there's many other cities that have.
San Francisco, I guess.
Yeah, I guess there's no, again, New York City has, as always, comparisons between New York City and other cities are a bit invidious, because you're just talking about a population that's just so much larger than any other city's population in this country. Having said that, there is definitely a trend where in cities with high housing costs, like Washington, D.C., like Boston, like San Francisco, like Los Angeles and New York, you have seen increases in family homelessness. Increases in family homelessness in New York have been the largest of any city in the country. And I think that speaks to, again, that sort of affordability gap getting wider and wider, that gap between incomes and rents.
You're educating me on this. The permanent housing options for someone coming out of a shelter. So supportive housing, people were formerly homeless, but they also have other additional supportive needs. So it sounds like it's not just an apartment, they also are receiving services as well.
Yes, support services, yeah.
What are the
And that's a fairly small number of housing units in the city.
What are the other options if you're a family in a shelter for a permanent, and I'm presuming, there's subsidized housing, there's rent-stabilized housing, what are the options for people coming out, trying to get permanent housing?
Well, right now, there's actually nothing, again, because of the policies of the last administration. It used to be that the city would allocate a certain number of federal housing programs, so public housing apartments or Section 8 vouchers. They'd allocate a certain number of them to families in shelter to help them leave the shelter system. And that was a policy that worked very well under Mayors Koch, Dinkins, and Giuliani. The Bloomberg administration eliminated that policy, and it was one of the biggest policy failures of that administration. I know the current administration is looking at restoring that as an option. Having said that, even during the time when the city used housing subsidies to help families leave the shelter system, around half of homeless families who left shelter and ended up leaving sort of on their own without subsidized housing into the private rental housing market. So the majority of families who leave shelter do leave to rent-stabilized housing. What the data has shown is that families who leave without housing subsidies have the highest return rates to homelessness, the highest return rates to shelter. A study that was done by a New York University researcher found that about half of families who left shelter without housing subsidies ended up coming back into shelter. And it was, again, because of all of the affordability issues that we were just talking about, that gap between their incomes and their rents.
So that housing subsidy, those housing subsidies have contracted quite a bit.
It isn't exactly that they contracted, although certainly the Congress has not helped in terms of funding for federal housing programs, particularly the House leadership. But the Bloomberg administration made a sort of ideological decision to take away those housing resources from targeting them to homeless families and children. So that was the policy mistake I was referring to.
Do you have any data? I heard this term for the first time. I didn't know that people say that they do this. Couch surfing, where they go, they're not, officially they're not homeless because they're not in a homeless shelter, but they are homeless, right? They don't have a stable home. They go from friends to friends. And I actually came across a couple, and people tell me my nephew staying with me, my sister staying with me, and then 6 months later, they are staying with them again. And I wonder if there's any way you can speak a little bit about that.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what is often referred to as kind of the hidden homeless population, is the population of doubled up renter households in the city. And I don't know if my colleagues at CSS might have this data, and if they don't, we can share that with the board. It's obviously far larger than the population that's actually in the shelter system or on the streets, is the number of doubled up households. And they are by and large the poorest households in the city. What the city data has shown, I was hoping to be able to get something more current for the board at this, for today, and I'll try and get something to follow up with. Around a quarter of families who come into the shelter system are coming in immediately after an eviction. So certainly evictions are a significant cause of homelessness for families. Another maybe roughly 40% are families that are coming in from these doubled up situations. Now often those are families that had been evicted but didn't want to take their kids and their family through the city shelter system, which if anybody read the Dasani time series is not something anybody wants to experience, particularly for children. So those families will often go and stay with a friend or relative, sleeping on their living room floor, making do, hoping that they can, make ends meet or escape that situation. Often it won't work out after a while, and those families will have to go. And so those are the families we often see coming into the system, as well as sort of families coming out of doubled up housing arrangements. And then there's about, and again, don't quote me on these stats and I'll try and get them to you. I mean, maybe 20% of families coming into the shelter system coming as a result of domestic violence. And then there's also a percentage of families coming from sort of health and safety related issues in housing. So really evictions and double ups are kind of, families coming from evictions and double ups are really the primary cause of families coming into the shelter system.
Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much.